that this was my sign-in, Robert. This is an issue we confront. I'd like you to look at this quote. I feel that I'm the same as you. I'm deaf, I'm signed, I'm in a community. We see all of our innovations within the community, both mainstream and on the deaf end, coming together. And I have to ask myself why I'm here. In the 80s and 90s, we saw people who have been involved in many things in the deaf community. You know, it's just amazing. When I looked at this, I realized that this is part of my experience and that I needed to accept it. You know, some people would rather be hearing the deaf, but that's not my experience. When you look at the space for deaf people, how do we want to envision our space? How do we want to use our space? What do we see? Do we see a stage for deaf people? When we look at design and how we see things, do we want them to remain the same? I don't think we're here on this planet for things to remain the same. We're here to make changes, maybe not profound changes, but to make changes. In the idea of deaf space, we need to look at each situation, every building from New York, Boston, Washington, D.C., every deaf campus, and see what the key designs are and how we can change those to better access the visual world of the deaf learner. My point is design. Deaf-friendly is not my point. Deaf-friendly means that I'm reserved and away from the world. What I needed to look at was not the world of the deaf, but to look at myself and see how I walk through an environment. Not to design an environment around me, but how I live within that environment to benefit all of us. It's not about designing a space or seeing something as separate, or to feel like I'm owed a certain thing. It's not about exporting a product or an idea or selling an idea. As an American, when I came into America and became an American, it was important for me to understand the American ways. Coming from Canada, I realized it was different. And one of the big changes was time. I thought about how things were exported, and in the idea of products that are made and exported into the country, like running shoes, they're made in a different place, and they're imported into the country and used to provide that experience. And I thought about that. And I thought about the deaf experience as the same way, that my design could be exported. And I realized that if my ideas and my designs were used, not only would it be something that's beneficial to me that I would make here, but something that would spread out and become beneficial to other people in that environment as well. So I didn't want to see things as how only the deaf community would see it, but how best to access it. And with the idea of Usher syndrome, as a person who grows up with Usher syndrome and the experiences that everyone has, They're very different. The visual identification is different, and the needs are different. There's an epistemology, a cognition, and a space and design, and all those things go together and influence the others. And when you think about them all, you realize what you see is what you learn, what you experience is what you learn, and there's the cognition of all of that becomes your experience. And if you can benefit from the resources in your environment, then it enhances your overall experience. So to design a deaf space would mean that to give myself to that project, when you think about the case studies that we used to design, we looked at 14 different case studies. We looked at a communal area where deaf and blind could all interact, and in that group of deaf blind, there were deaf and deaf blind all together. And some very interesting and funny things came to light. What ideas, thought, and touch had, and how those things were involved. And one thing struck me that I thought was pretty cool: the concept of this. The concept of justice. There was a town where space is really vital. And there's one place within this environment that was for him to touch. You could walk around it, you could go around it, but you couldn't place anything on it. It was taboo to place anything in that space. So upon moving stuff and cleaning, the janitor set something down, and one woman tripped over it because this environment had many blind people in it. She tripped over the area where she was supposed to have an empty walkway and hurt her face, and she was bloody, and she walked up to the person who was responsible for that and was very upset and started to cry. And they were looking for the person who did that and realized that when the community found out, they came together and had a huge meeting and to find out who had done it, and they kicked out the janitor who did it, or at least thought they should. After they had a lengthy discussion, they brought the person in, decided on the punishment, and the group, as a punishment, decided they would bring the person into the group, and every person would touch them. And the person who had been wounded in the fall would strike the person who put that object in her way. And I thought it was interesting because, to back up for a moment, I need to say that we see justice as different. If a woman's raped or someone's hurt or something bad happens, the law intercedes and police come into the court and they call in witnesses and there's a trial. There's a process. The person's put in jail, sometimes they're hung, or similar situations like that. Justice must be met, but it is detached from the person who's wounded, who's the victim. But they can see the process happening, and others can see the process happening. But to understand that deaf blind people, if they have someone that has committed a crime, they're removed completely from the punishment. They don't see the punishment happen to the person. So that idea of justice needing to be something that was felt by the community, and the touch being part of that process was vital, influenced how our ideas and our senses build upon us as people and lead to our abstract concepts, even abstract concepts like justice. So it wasn't just about space, but it was how we approach the abstract. So how our senses shape us as humans is highly impactful. So reading about these things and having a lot of answers to the questions I was asking led me to think about this. America is great. We've been established for 200 years. We have wonderful ideas and philosophies and many different cultural perspectives. America is great at that, but when offers are made for improvements, most times they're to go back and give you a little bit of history, Usher syndrome, in Germany, originally when there was some concentration and focus on that, the name was designed, the name was labeled at that time, Usher syndrome. There was a man in Germany who did all the work on Usher syndrome, and it was spread throughout the community, from the healthcare industry to social work, out into the deaf community, and people collaborated and shared ideas and thoughts about it at that time, and ideas were developed. We tried to find how best to help people with Usher syndrome, and even though it was the perspective of a disability, there was a realization that among the deaf institutes, there were about 300 graduates. They would go through school and graduate, but didn't really have a plan for post-graduation. Out of every 15 graduates from a residential deaf school, one would have Usher syndrome. So eventually, a screening process was set in place among all residential schools in the United States, and we looked for standardized numbers and ideas and curriculum, and a manual was developed. And there was a rehabilitative process that was approached. And it made me realize that there were many audiologists who provided speech and hearing training, testing and screening for hearing. And there were many for visual, to test for visual changes, visual impairments, but there were not very many recommendations. And I agree, this is back in 1977, we were recently developing things. The economy went crazy, and after that, the mantle was passed to the audiologist, and that's where it was carried forward for Usher syndrome. But I guess my point, going back to that, would be visual training. What kind of visual training was there? This is a chart that might show your visual field. Peripheral vision, for example, might be 10 to 15%. What you see, everything within your visual field, from the left to the right, your brain picks out what's important and filters that in. But understand that the visual filters in the important details as to what's needed, what needs to be focused on. And so, for one visual field on the left shows everything's within that visual field. But someone else's visual field might be a smaller percentage, maybe 8 to 10%. So if you're walking through an environment, say in an airport, from the store to the concourse and everything along your way, or if you're walking along the street, you might have a more limited visual field to just pick out the important information, and you translate that information into usable information. You get a sense of a boundary, like the side of the sidewalk, and how that moves off to your right. So you know how far you have to stay straight within those two boundaries at the edges of the sidewalk, so that you don't step off the sidewalk. It gives you spatial information to make adjustments in your daily life. So what I recognized was there was no curriculum for visual information and training. There was no visual training for how to use that information, that the limited amount of information that you can intake into your best interest. And we recognize that some of this visual training could even be beneficial to hearing people or other people who had good vision but could improve upon their learning through visual means. In the visual field we were hearing. Now on to curriculum. For new signers, we recognize that as they were coming into Gallaudet, people who didn't have signs, for example, coming into a program, we only had about 7 weeks, and we would sign to them, and they would struggle. They needed to reintegrate. They were brought into this environment and would be submerged into this environment and have to reintegrate. Well, the whole point of learning this was if you notice within these environments, the background is very important. You look at the sight line. You don't want to have to look everywhere around the room because you'll be lost. I would have been lost, depending on where the space was, where people were placed, where their faces are, what clothing they had on, how far away they were, what the background was behind them. This is a project board for a board meeting room. We do prefer to have a horseshoe-shaped room, but at Gallaudet there are some issues that we faced. We had PowerPoint, we had captioning, we had interpreters, so there were lots of logistics. You had to look to the interpreter to the left, and the person speaking to your right, and someone behind you with the captioning, the PowerPoint. And what we did was try and condense all the information into one main area. And to do that, we had to design not a round room, but more of an oval shape, so that we didn't have to look to the left and in front and to the right, but rather that you could get each piece of information in a semicircle, perhaps to your left, and have access to all that information within your visual field. And to move those pieces around, there was a lot of information